Let's just dive right in, shall we? Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to pry open what used to be considered the ultimate locked black box, the human mind. For centuries, people were just kind of left in the dark, totally struggling with their own unexplained behaviors and, frankly, a lot of suffering. But today, we're tracing the evolution of psychological therapy. We're going to look at the brilliant and honestly, sometimes radical frameworks that finally managed to pick that lock and reveal the hidden forces driving human behavior.
And we've got to start with this absolute bombshell of a realization from Sigmund Freud. He said, the ego is not master in its own house. Think about how shocking that was. For over 2,000 years, philosophy treated us primarily as these perfectly rational creatures, Homo sapiens, right? But Freud comes along and argues, actually no, we are deeply rooted in nature. We're driven by instincts and desires that are operating completely behind our own backs. That conscious part of you, the part you think of as you, the ego, it's simply not the one calling all the shots, not even close. So here's our roadmap to avoid getting mental whiplash. We'll hit 1. Masters of the hidden mind. 2. Id, ego, and superego. 3. Neuroses, psychoses, and coping. 4. The games people play. 5. Correcting our automatic thoughts. And we'll wrap up with 6. Gestalt therapy and awareness.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, Masters of the Hidden Mind.
You know, before Freud decided to actually just sit down and listen to people, treatments for mental distress were, frankly, terrifying. We're talking ice water baths, spinning patients in literal massive centrifuges, or even exorcisms. Freud completely flipped the script by suggesting that mental illness actually stems from our life history. So let's nail down a couple of historical terms here. First, the unconscious. That's where our deepest, darkest secrets live. And then there's libido. Freud theorized this as a boiling cauldron of raw, instinctual energy that just drives us forward. Now, it gets misunderstood all the time as being purely sexual, but Freud's libido actually covers all life-affirming energy. We're talking self-love, the bond between a parent and child, friendship, even, a passionate devotion to a scientific idea. And because the unconscious is entirely hidden from us, all that energy only leaks out sideways, through our dreams, neurotic symptoms, or those embarrassing accidental slips of the tongue.
Moving right along to Section 2, Id, ego, and superego.
To really explain our inner conflicts, Freud mapped out this famous structural model. He basically wanted to pinpoint exactly why we always feel so torn inside. And he identified these 3 strict masters of our mind. You've got the poor ego, right? And it is just constantly sweating, trying to mediate between the wild desires of the id, the incredibly strict rules of the superego, and the actual harsh boundaries of the real world. Imagine you're at a newsstand and you see a magazine you really want. Your id is practically screaming at you to just steal it because, hey, pleasure principle. But then your superego acts as this severe moral conscience, telling you stealing is absolutely wrong. So your ego has to step in, look at the reality, which is that you have 0 cash on you, and somehow negotiate a peace treaty between these warring factions in your head. Have you ever just inexplicably snapped at a colleague? Freud had this great analogy for that. He likened the ego to a rider on a massively powerful horse. A lot of the time, the rider can't actually steer the horse at all. They just kind of pretend they wanted to go in the exact direction the horse decided to bolt anyway. The ego gets completely overwhelmed and then desperately rationalizes the raw urges of the id, just to maintain this fragile illusion that we're actually in control.
Which brings us to Section 3, Neuroses, Psychoses, and Coping.
So, what exactly happens when the ego is completely overwhelmed by all these competing demands and reality just becomes totally unbearable? How do we handle that immense pressure without just entirely falling apart? Well, we use coping mechanisms. Take sublimation, for example. Sometimes sports teams will literally enforce celibacy before a massive match. Why? To deliberately sublimate or channel all that unspent libidinal energy into pure, aggressive focus on the field. Or consider the classic Freudian slip. Imagine someone misreading a supermarket sign that says save as die. That's their deep, unconscious fear leaking out, secretly terrified that their cheap, unhealthy diet is literally going to kill them. The unconscious, it turns out, always finds a way out.
But when those coping mechanisms fail, that's when illness sets in. A neurotic person might develop actual physical symptoms, like blinding migraines, just to unconsciously escape a wildly stressful job. A psychotic person, on the other hand, might just invent a totally new reality, where there's, say, Napoleon. You see, neurosis doesn't deny reality. It just uses illness as a hiding place from it. Psychosis finds reality so agonizingly painful that it completely overwrites it with hallucinations or delusions. It's kind of like Don Quixote pretending he's a knight in the Middle Ages just to escape a corrupt, modernizing world he couldn't handle.
Okay, let's shift gears to Section 4, the games people play.
Let's step out of the deep, dark unconscious for a minute and zoom out to the social mind. We're moving from what's happening inside your own head to what happens between people. This is transactional analysis, developed by Eric Berne. Now, instead of the id and the superego, transactional analysis proposes that we constantly shift between three ego states: parent, adult, and child, during literally every social transaction. We send out messages from one of these states, and we unconsciously target a specific state in the person we're talking to.
And communication flows perfectly smoothly in what we call complementary transactions. That's when the address states match up. But man, conflict erupts instantly when you get a cross-transaction. Think of a boss speaking down to an employee from a parent state, and the employee immediately responds defensively from a child state. Or imagine you just casually ask someone, "Hey, is there a restaurant nearby?" Coming from your logical adult state, but they snap back with, "Don't treat me like your servant," from an angry child state. Boom, the transaction crosses, and communication immediately breaks down.
And these mismatched transactions create what Berne called games, and they come with hidden emotional payoffs. A classic example is a woman who unconsciously chooses a hyper-busy partner. Why? So she can constantly complain, "If it weren't for you, I'd have a career." But what she's actually doing is secretly masking her own deep, terrifying fear of independence. This game gives her a perverse psychological benefit. She gets to play the victim, she harvests all this sympathy from her friends, who play the rescuers, and she never actually has to face the scary prospect of pursuing her ambitions. It's a totally zero-sum game, but it is incredibly predictable.
All right, moving on to Section 5, correcting our automatic thoughts.
We're pivoting now to the modern era, focusing not on some deep childhood trauma from decades ago, but on the conscious thoughts happening in your brain right this very second. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, argues we don't necessarily need to dig up the past to fix what's hurting us today. Imagine being ignored at a party. If you interpret that as "nobody likes me," you're going to feel completely crushed. But if you interpret it as "great, I can just relax and enjoy my drink," you feel joy. The event is identical. The internal instruction is what dictates the emotion. We are constantly running this inner dialogue. It's like an invisible narrator in our heads assigning a value to every single situation. Change the narrator and you instantly change the feeling.
Emotional distress usually stems from these faulty automatic thoughts and cognitive errors. Think of them as basically bugs in our mental software. Take polarized thinking, for instance, where we assume one tiny little mistake completely ruins our entire week. Or selective abstraction. That happens when a situation is, say, 95% positive, but your brain lasers in on that one minor negative detail and decides to make it the total, defining reality of your day. We've all been there, right?
But here's the good news. CBT empowers us to fix these errors by acting like scientists of our own mind. You observe the thought, identify the error, and then directly test it as a hypothesis, rather than just blindly accepting it as absolute truth. When you have a thought pop up like, "I am a total failure," Aaron T. Beck's method teaches you to catch it. You recognize it as an overgeneralization, look for hard, factual evidence against it, and then deliberately practice a new, realistic thought. It literally strips the power right away from your inner critic.
Which brings us to our final stop, Section 6, Gestalt Therapy and Awareness.
Finally, we conclude with our fourth lens, pioneered by Fritz Perls. This approach prioritizes the holistic, present experience over just intellectualizing the past. Where psychoanalysis constantly asks why, Gestalt therapy simply asks what and how. Gestalt is all about awareness and closing open mental loops. When we avoid contact with our true desires or our environment, we create serious internal conflict and get stuck in these protective but very limiting layers, kind of like an onion. Perls believe that actual growth requires assimilating the world into ourselves. When we block that natural contact, maybe we project our anger onto other people, or we blur our boundaries so much we forget what we even want, we leave situations totally unresolved. We leave these gestalts open.
To break through those onion layers, Gestalt therapists use some pretty creative methods, like the famous empty chair technique. This is where a client might literally converse with an imagined person or even a rejected part of themselves to reclaim responsibility for their feelings. Instead of just sitting there talking about a dream where a scary dog chases them, a therapist might tell the client to sit in the empty chair and physically act out the role of the dog.
This highly creative, dramatic step forces them to stop alienating parts of their own personality and start bringing the fragmented pieces of their self back together.
But Pearls famously warned against therapists just relying on cheap tricks. True growth is a serious, lifelong process of assimilating the world into the self. In fact, he absolutely despised the idea of therapists just blindly applying the empty chair technique like it was some sort of parlor trick. Genuine awareness isn't a quick fix, guys. It is a profound and honestly sometimes uncomfortable stripping away of the protective layers we've spent a lifetime building up.
So as we wrap up this journey through the different lenses of the human mind, I want to leave you with one core therapeutic question from the Gestalt tradition to ponder on your own time. What unclosed gestalts are you avoiding right now? Whether it's a hidden drive from your ib, a toxic social game you're stuck playing, a buggy automatic negative thought, or an open loop you just refuse to close, the tools to unlock your own black box are literally right there in front of you. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning what's going on beneath the surface.